Hello, I'm Victoria Nagudi, and with me is Dr. Kenneth Dillon, a researcher with CNTIA Press. Today, we're going to investigate a theory proposed by Dr. Dillon himself, the theory of the red blood cells. The theory of the red blood cells posits that the red blood cells form a system that serves as the dermal-optic photoreceptor, the animal magnetoreceptor, the cellular basis of consciousness, and the ultrasensitive psi receptor. Ken, this is a lot to handle. Before we delve into each of the dimensions of this robust theory, could you please tell us what's so special, in fact, about the red blood cells?
All right. We know from starters that the red blood cells have a really extraordinary role in the way the body works to transport oxygen and then to get rid of carbon dioxide. And there are trillions of these little red blood cells. They also have in them an amazing amount of hemoglobin, 270 million molecules of hemoglobin in every single tiny red blood cell. So that means, in addition, then that they have a lot of iron. They also have an anaerobic metabolism, and there are just a whole number of other ways in which they differ from the rest of the cells in the body. And most notably, for our purposes, they have, as they begin their lives, they have a nucleus, but then they drop it. And that means that they're enucleate. And so you can't say that human beings are completely eukaryotic creatures, because here is a very important component of the human body that does not have a nucleus in each of these cells. So in that sense, and in some other senses, for instance, their exceptional ultrasensitivity to light and to various kinds of magnetic fields, they really are a very special type of cell. And so we need to ask whether they're capable of doing other things than transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide.
So, there are a lot of terms going around here. The next one is magnetoreception. What do you mean in particular by a magnetoreception?
For about almost 200 years now, scientists have been studying the way in which animals interact with the geomagnetic field. And that includes human beings, perhaps. But at any rate, they've studied what is called the magnetoreceptor in animals. And of course, there's a great deal of uncertainty as to what the magnetoreceptor is. But we do have extensive data on how animals navigate their way through magnetic fields. So there's no doubt that they have some kind of system of magnetoreceptor. And when we say magnetoreceptor, we assume also that they have a magnetoanalyzer too. And so they've studied this. They've come up with an explanation, and that is that the magnetite in the various parts of the bodies of these animals is actually responding to the magnetic field, and maybe that's the magnetoreceptor, but we can see that that's not a very satisfactory one, even though humans actually have a little bit of magnetite in their skulls. It's not something that we really have a theory of how it might work as an analyzer or even as a receptor. And so there's another actual explanation, and that is that the protein cryptochrome, which can be found in a number of animals, has been shown to be sensitive under light conditions to the geomagnetic field in birds. And even there's some thought that that might hold for human beings, because we have quite a bit of cryptochrome in our eyes. But it's never been proven in human beings, although it's been shown that the human cryptochrome, when transferred to Drosophila, a model, actually does seem to be somehow sensitive to magnetic fields. So at any rate, there's a lot of research going on, and it's been increasingly fruitful, but still no certainty about what the animal magnetoreceptor might consist of, or how a magnetoanalyzer would do its job.
And then dermal optic photoreception. What is that?
Dermal-optic photoreception is something that has been talked about since the 16th and 17th century. And no doubt there were some people who had noticed it long before that. Dermal optics means that the body is able to sense to in effect see through the skin, to sense the world around it. And this is not true in every case. Perhaps 5 to 10% of the population has this capability. And perhaps others have it, they just don't know how to summon it up. At any rate, it's been studied most intensively in the Soviet Union, in Sverdlovsk, present-day Yekaterinburg. And the Soviet scientists hunted and hunted, and finally, by a process of elimination, they determined that it must be the red blood cells. And they were very amazed at that. That's an amazing thing. But that's what they found. And so if you think about dermal optics and that there's a dermal optic photoreceptor and it's the red blood cells, naturally the question arises, well, could the red blood cells also be the animal magnetoreceptor? And
of course. I mean, anybody would think that. Comes from third grade on. So I'm going to ask the same question for psi reception, which is another thing that many people may have not heard.
Psi, psi, the ultrasensitive psi receptor. Psi is PSI, and it refers to all the phenomena that are non-rational, that are traditionally have been called extrasensory perception, ESP, and it's a wide range of capabilities. And the question of whether, first of all, whether there is psi or not in human beings and in animals, the evidence has accumulated, and especially a lot of very powerful statistical evidence that indeed there is such a psi capability. And by now, many or most scientists accept that. However, there is a group of scientists who vehemently protest against it and say, no, there is no such thing as psi capability. And in my theory, I argue that the red blood cells very much in a way parallel to the way that they are the dermal optic photoreceptor and the animal magnetoreceptor also form the ultrasensitive psi receptor.
So are you saying that what you've observed from red blood cells makes you believe that there is a psi receptor, or that you assume that if there is a psi receptor, it must be the red blood cells?
I'll go with either of those formulations. I feel happy with either of those formulations. And I think one of the things that we have to do in theory is to try to look at each corner of the theory and see how they fit together with each other. And one of the ways I did that with the dermal optics, not the dermal optics, with the animal magnetoreceptor, and one other thing we haven't talked about yet, and that's the cellular basis of consciousness, was to collect all of the criteria or perceptions out there in the literature that I happen to have that would match the red blood cells. And I found a list of 18 of such criteria or perceptions with a magnetoreceptor, and 14 with the red blood cells being the fourth of these things, and that is the cellular basis of consciousness, or as it's sometimes called, the solution to the binding problem of consciousness. That somewhere, this is something that all the neuroscientists are quite aware of, and philosophers too. They're aware that there must be something that enables us to pull together, to integrate all of the streams of data that are coming into us, including from inside of our own heads, but from all of our senses. And that's called the binding problem of neuroscience. And there are thousands of scientists and philosophers who are busy working on it.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask if you could provide us with a briefer on that, but it seems like you've done a good job of that. So I have some specific questions now on this theory now that we've settled our terms, so I guess we can get into it. Could you, in more detail, I know you hit on this a little bit before, but could you further elaborate on your general understanding of red blood cells, including what informs it?
Okay, it was actually informed by several sources. The first was I was working in a medical startup and biomedical startup, and it was with biophotonic therapy, or as it used to be called, or still is called by some people, ultraviolet blood irradiation. And in that process, I came right up against red blood cells as part of a very important component of the blood. So I was quite familiar with the literature on biophotonic therapy. I'd written a book about it, uh, and it's related to the science of biophotonics. Biophotonics is the study of light within the body, the natural light within our cells, and as it's used around the body. And that's something that is a newish area of science, and it's got a great deal of attention from many scientists. It's not closely related with biophotonic therapy. They sort of live side by side, but don't talk too much to each other. But those were two sources. And the third source was I went to Moscow, and I talked with Professor Vladimir Voykov, a professor of biology at Moscow State University. And he had some comments to make. He was the one, for instance, who gave me the background on the Russian scientists deciding that the red blood cells were the dermal-optic photoreceptor. And he also said he said two things that were very interesting about the red blood cells. The one was specifically the red blood cells, the other was about the blood. But the red blood cells, he said that they are ultra sensitive to electromagnetic radiation. And I thought that that was something very, very interesting. But even more interesting was that he said, if you think about it in real time, in other words, in instantaneous time, the whole blood is a well-ordered system. And that's a really profound insight, I think. And I started to think about what the implications of that might be for these various phenomena that we're discussing today.
Hmm. So, I mean, I guess, yeah, this initial understanding then made you start, seeing other connections with different, I guess, phenomena that had been observed in human beings at certain times in history, and that maybe didn't have any explanations attached to them. So I would say dermal optics is definitely a candidate within that category. So I was next going to ask what informs your knowledge about that, and what you've read about that independently of your research on red blood cells, but also in relation to it.
Dermal optics is something that has been very much attacked in the Anglo-Saxon world as something that can't possibly be true. But if you look at the arrangement of the human eye, you can get a kind of notion of how it works, and that is that it's sometimes pointed out that nature made a mistake or evolution made a mistake in the way it put in front of the iris, where we have a great concentration of nerve endings that lead up into the brain. It put in front of those a whole maze or network of little microcapillaries. And that doesn't seem a very correct thing to do. They were sort of slightly blocking or blurring the vision of the eye. But if we're thinking of dermal optics, then we see that in those capillaries are red blood cells, so that actually nature provided a very excellent solution to how to provide both of its systems of vision, its red blood cell based vision, and its ordinary eye, what we're familiar with, the ocular vision, so that they're both served in a very fine way at this place where there's a thinner boundary between them and the outside world than anywhere else in the body.
But could it also just be a coincidence where every part of the body needs to get blood supply, and so blood vessels just happen to be there also?
Yes, you could say that, but you could also say, but then why did they put it in front of the eye? So that seems funny for evolution to do that, unless it had another agenda. But at any rate, that's one of the things that caught my eye.
Hmm. So, in terms of the research that you've done on dermal optics, what sources did you draw upon in particular? And what in particular has informed your understanding of it, would you say?
I would say the idea with the red blood cells that they are peculiarly capable of handling light, and they do some funny things. Professor Boykov said he had never observed that the red blood cells emitted any photons. And yet we have a very interesting account from the 19th century, the American Civil War. The surgeons and doctors would go into the tents after the battle, and in the darkness at night in the tents, they would see that some of the soldiers' wounds were glowing in the dark, and they called it the phosphorescence of wounds. And that suggests that there have been several explanations, but clearly one very powerful one is that the blood was actually providing light there, that there was a chemiluminescent original immune system. And they found that those soldiers who had this phosphorescence of wounds were much more likely to survive and be fine, whereas the others would die. So we have a very dramatic instance there. Now that goes against what Professor Voykov was saying, that he had never observed it. I guess the difference is that in the body itself, in vivo itself, and under the great challenge of a serious wound, the body's original immune system, which was centered on the red blood cells, would come to play, and the red blood cells would start to glow and to emit photons.
Why do you think that is?
Why do I think it is? Well, it's because of a lot of other things, and like a lot of other things in the theory, it fits together. It fits very well with the way the way the theory is all set up. How each of the parts of it is somehow integrated with the other ones.
Right, like the phosphorescence effect relates to the light reception ability of the red blood cells, which relates to, dermal optic photoreception, which relates to other um, abilities. So, in terms of the ability of magnetoreception, I was hoping, now that you've already kind of given a primer on what it is for the audience, that you could elaborate more on why and how you believe that red blood cells act as a magnetoreceptor in humans.
I think we need to consider what the body had, what our distant ancestors' bodies had, say going 2 billion years back. That there was a tiny little oligocellular creature there, and one day that creature started to grow a neuron, and gradually there came to be more and more neurons. Well, at that point, when you began to have a nervous system and maybe start a brain and so on, do we suppose that that evolution would have taken this kind of intelligence of the red blood cells and that is now encapsulated in the red blood cells, the intelligence that it must have had to get to that point, because there had been an evolution of 2 billion years up to that point since the beginning of life. And despite all the vicissitudes of that evolution, the the our ancestors had survived and flourished. So they must have had a remarkable intelligence. So is the body going to, is evolution, nature going to toss out that intelligence? I think not. I think it would find a way to embody it even as the neuronal system would develop. So that in effect, we have two systems of intelligence in us. And that can explain a lot.
But in terms of magnetoreception in particular, um, independently of, this general perceptual quality or immune intelligence, um, what is the basis for believing that this magnetoreceptive ability is still present? Not in terms of the idea that it wouldn't make sense for the body to get rid of it, but in terms of um, what has actually been shown to be present in the body now.
Uh, well, let me step back from that a little bit uh, to say that the red blood cells, I think, need to be considered in the framework of the newer understanding in the past 50 years of, it actually goes back again much farther, but of the bacterial world or the microbial world, that in effect microbes are colonial animals. And I think to the extent that the red blood cells have these remarkable properties and so on, they're acting as part of a colony. And therefore, we can call the red blood cells themselves, since they're beyond being eukaryotic, we can call them metakaryotic. And we can call their joint operation, we can call that a metacolony. It's not a colony. Granted, they are not prokaryotes. They're not prokaryotic cells, but they have certain features like that. So operating as a colony, they are very capable, I argue, of having a very high computational capability. And that would help greatly with the problem of the magnetoreceptor. One of the strong points, I think, of the aspect of the magnetoreception in the theory is that in this theory, the magnetoreceptor and the magnetoanalyzer are identical. You don't need to take all those data coming in from the geomagnetic field, absorb them in the red blood cells, and then send them somewhere else, to the brain or somewhere else, for that to do the cogitating, the analysis. No, it happens, the receptor is the analyzer. And I think that's a great simplification.
Hmm. So, if it is true that red blood cells act as magnetoreceptors in the human body, why do we not seem to have the ability to sense magnetic fields or to use them for navigation?
Why do we keep losing our way? Why do we have
Right.
such a hard
Why
time?
are we lost in this world?
Um, I think we can come up with some reasons. It's hard to get a definitive one. One is that we're urban creatures. We're living away from nature. Another is that we're upright creatures. Maybe if we would be spread out, spread eagle like in a turtle fashion, we would be more able to sense to sense the cells. We're also living in an electromagnetic, artificial electromagnetic environment, and so that could affect it. So there are all kinds of reasons. However, it's also true that there are many reports of human navigators who have accomplished very remarkable feats, and one can suppose that they used their magnetoreceptive capabilities to do that. However, there are also a whole bunch of other reasons for it. For instance, they could be using the sun or the stars or whatever to navigate,
Or their phones, perhaps.
or the cell phone just as well. Uh,
So,
so as a result of all this, there are a bunch of reasons why we should not be so good ourselves at magnetoreception. And I think one way of actually testing this part of the theory and the other related one, the dermal-optic photoreception, is to find people who are sensitives. And the assumption is that people who are sensitives in dermal optics are likely also to be sensitives in terms of magnetoreception, and to test them. Not to prove that everybody in the world has these capabilities, just try to develop some evidence that these people have these capabilities. And I think that's something that is a very doable test.
I mean, if they had a test, so what one thing is that there could be magnetoreception without actual magnetic navigation in the sense that perhaps the presence of a certain electromagnetic field like exerts some influence on the body, but that doesn't carry over to anything that comes into consciousness or has to even do with like spatial analysis or orientation or whatnot. But perhaps there are like very small, minute changes that occur in the body due to electromagnetic fields. One experiment that could possibly be done, I don't know. Well, first they would have to find a way to identify and quantify what magnetoreception is present, what dermal optic photoreception is present. But then if they could do like some sort of actual platelet count for people and show that people with more platelets, for example, have more of these indicators, and that would be very firm evidence. But there could also be other experiments done around this.
Yes,
Um,
yes, and it's related to another part of the whole thing, and that is the psi research. That there are some very active programs of psi research going on right now. So those people are in a very good position to start investigating the red blood cells in this, according to this theory.
So the binding problem, I'm going to now turn over the forum to that. What do red blood cells have to do with the binding problem? We want to get a little bit more into that. And of course, why do you say so? Why should we believe it?
Okay. They're the solution, I argue, to the binding problem of consciousness. And one way to think about it is to compare them to the neurons, which are their main competitors, at least in the Western world. And that would show very quickly that the neurons are too large. They're too rooted in one spot. They don't have the flexibility, and they're too slow. The red blood cells really excel at those three capacities. And so they are in a much better position to provide this real-time understanding of what's going on in the world and this integration of all of the flows of data.
Hmm. Okay, and then what do brain scans and other observations about the body seem to suggest about red blood cells, both in the context of the binding problem of consciousness, but also in the context of all the other abilities that you've posited?
Functional magnetoresonance imaging is based on the principle that when a certain group of neurons in the brain start to be excited and start to think or whatever they're doing, that the blood rushes to that place. And that's possible to interpret in two ways. That first of all, they thought that it was bringing oxygen to help the neurons. But then they realized that actually the red blood cells were keeping their oxygen. Very little oxygen was used. And instead, the neurons were using glucose. But of course, the glucose could have been what the blood was bringing, not the red blood cells. But there is a perception that comes from it all, I think, that is hard to ignore, and that is it would be very consistent with the red blood cells coming to the location of excitation and viewing it using their optical capabilities and analyzing it using their calculating capabilities.
By viewing, you kind of mean picking up information.
Yes.
And I see. Okay. Um, in terms of the oxygen, could there be other explanations? Do you know whether those red blood cells have the same amount of oxygen all the time, or if they acquire more oxygen when they come to the brain but fail to use it, which is, reason for suspicion?
I don't really know the answer to that.
You don't. Okay. I think that that answer is important when it comes to things like this. Um, in terms of the psi receptor, another function that you posited, what should viewers grasp about it and related functions in the context of red blood cells?
Well, we need to think of questions like, for instance, how might it fit with distance viewing? Uh, Back during the Cold War, the US government paid very sensitive people who had these ESP capabilities to do remote vision of Soviet missile sites and to draw what they saw. And they drew some drawings that were actually quite faithful in an odd way to the actual sites. But when asked, they couldn't explain what it was that they were seeing. They just happened to draw what they perceived, and one can say that could be an instance of the red blood cell metacolony encountering phenomena that were beyond its grasp, were modern technological phenomena, and that's something that system of intelligence that we have is not up on, doesn't know how to deal with.
Hmm. And then, just in general, what other findings have contributed to your conception of red blood cells and what they're capable of?
I think a very important one was the track record of biophotonic therapy. That biophotonic therapy, one Russian scientist remarked, is too effective against infectious diseases for it to be just a coincidence, and that must uh, show that it goes back to that it's stimulating an original immune system of the human beings. And I think if you look at biophotonic therapy, ultraviolet blood irradiation, where a small amount, maybe 3 or 4% of the blood is subjected to ultraviolet, or nowadays they use different visible light on it, and then is reinfused in the body, and has a very excellent action against infectious diseases. that would be an example of the kind of thing that led me to to trust more and more in the capacities of the red blood cells.
And that again goes back to photoreception.
Yes,
So
yes, very definitely. And as a matter of fact, the Russians did some testing of, instead of biophotonic therapy, magnetic blood hemotherapy, as they called it, and they got very parallel results.
really, I guess, and now I can ask how you believe that this information should be received and what implications you think it should have.
Well, it would be very helpful if some major journal would write to me and say, we've read your article and we would love to publish it, but that's not going to happen. And so the theory, which I came up with 20 years ago, is basically on my website and in one self-published book. However, there's been some good coming out of that, and that is that I've been able to work on the theory and develop it, and I think that that's been a very useful process. What could be done with it? Well, clearly we need to do some testing, some experimenting, and so maybe first these psi researchers, but there's nobody stopping any of the researchers who are working on magnetoreception from starting to work on the theory of the red blood cells. And the same holds true for all these other dimensions, including the consciousness, the consciousness cells. I should tell you, as part of the way that the theory has been received, I've received a number of responses. My favorite one was I was talking with a neuroscientist at a reception. I mentioned that I had a theory of consciousness and that it was the red blood cells acting as a metacolony. And he said, the red blood cells. And then he excused himself and went and got another glass of beer. And he came back 2 minutes later and very nicely told me his neuronal theory of the cellular basis of consciousness. But I thought that was very honest of him. It was an honest reaction.
Sometimes you need a drink.
To show his amazement at this idea.
So I think that when it comes to anything even tangentially related to dualism, there are never going to be any studies that can convince everyone. So that's just kind of untouchable territory. But there's other research that can be done for empiricists and physicalists around this theory. What other research do you believe needs to be done? Do you have anything in particular that you've been wanting to see come from this?
Well, it would be useful if all of the philosophers who deal with this, and it's good that you mentioned philosophy, because I haven't talked about it, but the philosophers are very interested in especially the problem of consciousness. And also it would be very useful if psychologists and psychiatrists and so on who are interested in psi capabilities would become interested enough to start investigating, start to organize experiments. And if we think there were some experiments done in the United Kingdom back at the end of the last century, they were done to test the magnetoreception capabilities of human beings. And the finding of that was generally favorable, that yes, humans do have a magnetoreceptor. However, that all the findings and so on in that research were all fiercely attacked and are generally not accepted nowadays, although I think if you go back and you look at them and dig through them, you can find some real gems in there, some value there. So if he could do that, Robin Baker, then there's no reason why hundreds of other scientists can't be doing that kind of thing with the idea of testing the theory of the red blood cells.
Hmm. And what difficulties do you believe exist around the research potentials for the theory of red blood cells? And how do you think they can be surmounted?
Of course, like any new idea, there's the problem of scientific rejectionism, and we know that that's very powerful. And in fact, we have a very good example with the psi research that for decades, psi research was rejected by most scientists and really stigmatized. But gradually, by doing more and more careful studies, and especially quantitative studies with very fancy statistics, they gradually won over more and more of the scientists. So it shows that by diligent work over decades, you can hope gradually to correct a case of scientific rejectionism. Now, there are always going to be skeptics, professional skeptics or amateurs, and rejectionists who are going to reject whatever you come up with, but you don't have to pay attention to them. You can pay attention to the people who are listening and who are asking the right questions and willing to work with you.
Yeah, I think you need to show what the theory relies on. And then if you can prove one thing that it relies on, or, the two or three most foundational things, then you can open up, the potential to have credibility for all of the things that those findings entail. So, Dr. Dillon has just presented us with his novel theory of the red blood cells, and together we examined his grounds for the idea that they support functions such as magnetoreception, photoreception, and something analogous to psi reception. We've also looked at an argument laying the groundwork to support their role in a proposed solution for the binding problem of consciousness. Ken, do you have anything that you want to reiterate or add in before we let the audience go?
I should mention that the information on my website very much supplements it in much more detail. There's an article called The Theory of the Red Blood Cells that provides plenty of detail. And I'd also like to mention that this all emerged from a mixing together of Russian and American researchers at the end after the Cold War. It's a very nice little episode, I think, in the history of the United States and Russia.
Yeah, well, the truth knows no borders. Together we must pursue it. So that concludes our interview. This theory is developing. Until next time, I'm Victoria Nagudi, and this is Dr. Kenneth Dillon of CNTO Press. Thank you so much.